Hi everyone, I'm Claire Enterline. I'm from the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and I'm also a PhD student under Damian Brady. And I want to thank our collaborators at DMR as well. So as we have been talking about, American lobster have been experiencing population declines both in southern New England, which has remained depleted, however more stabilized, as noted in the last stock assessment. Then that last stock assessment also noting a population reduction in the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock. And this has been suggested to be tied to rising temperatures, as seen in bottom temperatures over the period on the Northeast Shelf, as well as more regionally in the Gulf of Maine, both warmer temperatures and an increased frequency and duration of marine heat waves in the Gulf of Maine. And so the point of this project is to build a scientific understanding of the changes in lobster populations and the influences of those ecosystem drivers, with a focus on rapid, high magnitude, potentially irreversible regime shifts and tipping points. And I have to apologize, I'm losing my voice because I've been talking a lot the last few days, so bear with me. And our specific goals are to identify relationships between substrates and environmental covariates on catchability, specifically of fisheries independent surveys, and understanding the influence of environmental conditions on abundance and breakpoints in those relationships, and further understanding whether those breakpoints represent tipping points into new stable states. So I'm going to walk you through a few different parts of this project. We're looking at ecosystem drivers such as currents, both more near-shore, small-scale currents such as the Eastern Maine coastal current, as well as large-scale dynamics like the Gulf Stream. Looking at temperature, both annual and seasonal, bottom, surface, days above 20, days between 12 and 18. Looking at population responses. This project in the future will be looking at abundance, but I want to be clear that I'm not going to be talking about that today. But looking at changes in species composition, specifically predator-prey dynamics, and then changes in behavior, such as Xiaoyun discussed before, the seeking of deeper depths, likely due to finding a preferred temperature range, as well as changes in benthic habitat use, with the idea that it might be becoming more variable over time, and the interplay that habitat availability has in that across the region. So I'll first focus in on ecosystem drivers. So as mentioned before, and by Damian's talk this morning, there are both large-scale patterns changing in offshore currents, as well as near-shore patterns changing in the Gulf of Maine. And what I want to focus in on is the difference between a trend and a regime shift. So a trend being a single changing mean over time, whereas a regime shift being a rapid change in the mean into a new stable state. So we'll be looking for regime shifts and also doing trend analyses in current patterns and temperature, salinity, and ecosystem conditions such as primary productivity, zooplankton, predator overlap, and fishery exploitation rate. And we're doing this both across the Northeast region, and not including Canada, sorry. And then also near-shore areas from the coast out to 12 nautical miles. And we'll be using fishery independent survey data to compare this to. So some preliminary results of the regime shift analyses. We're finding that the Gulf Stream has experienced multiple regime shifts over the time period. However, I want to note the consistent 2011 regime shift that it was found to shift towards the coast. That's coincident with the near-shore temperature regime shifts that we're seeing, both bottom temperature and surface temperature. So we're seeing, hold on, I'm pointing this to her. Let's try this again. Here's the, okay, here we go. Okay, so 2011 regime shifts in surface temperature. For most of the nearshore regions, these are the statistical areas. Some are simplified for southern New England, as well as bottom temperature regime shifts in 2011 as well in southern New England. And while these were not found for bottom temperatures in the Gulf of Maine, this is one tool to be looking at change over time. And those are for annual temperatures. We can also look at this seasonally, and so this will be a next step of this work, is to break down the nearshore and offshore regime shifts by season. So here, showing that in Zone B, for the lobster management Zone B along the Maine coast, that a regime shift in surface temperature is noted in the summer in 2010, while other seasons did not indicate a regime shift. And also, just because a regime shift is not noted does not mean that there is not a trend. And so we are also looking at trends here. So you can see that we're finding increasing trends in bottom temperature in eastern Maine as well. And so then we will take that information done both regionally and for nearshore areas and understand their influence on population responses. We will be looking at abundance in the future, but right now I'm going to focus on some work that was done by some of my colleagues on predators. So Andrew Allen and Bart DiFiore at GMRI were looking at how species have been shifting in their center of latitude over time. This is a paper that came out of Kathy's lab last year, both for deeper depths and higher latitudes. And what Andrew and Bart did was then to take the suite of species identified as lobster predators by the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center Food Diet Database, filter those species to those large enough to eat juvenile lobsters, and then to develop a spatial distribution model using year, season, varying season time effects, a survey effect, and depth and seasonal bottom temperature, looking at both nearshore and the federal trawl surveys to understand how the specific lobster predator species suite has shifted over time. And so I apologize that this is a lot of maps and very small scale, but on the left over here, this is the change in this is an SDM on juvenile lobster abundance, and so you can see it shifting over time towards the northeast, and also looking at potential lobster predator biomass and its shift over time. Their next step was then to overlay those two models, and they increased the grid size to look at the overlap in a different way, and pointing out here with the red circles that while there was low predator overlap earlier in the time period in the 1990s, that has increased over time and predicted to be higher in recent years. And now we'll focus in on looking at how those changes in ecosystem drivers, population responses, can influence habitat use. So here's our lobster, and how we think about it in rocky areas, but with those changes in temperature and potentially a reduction in predators in the 1990s from the decrease of the cod population, that those lobsters are going to be moving into more open areas, both because there's not as much predator exposure and their physiological demands may make them want to go into different kinds of habitat. And now with warmer temperatures as well, we have new predator species that, because lobster are an open habitat, may be more subject to predation. Adding on to this, what the seafloor actually looks like. So this is a map of the seafloor for sediment off of New Harbor, Maine. Red is rock, blue is mud, green is gravel. And there's bathymetric contours, depth contours on this as well. And you can see that the incidence of rock is highly correlated in Maine with depth. So when a lobster is potentially moving into deeper depths, as you saw earlier, in an earlier presentation, to find a more suitable temperature for themselves, they're quickly moving from rock into mud. If you overlay then our fisheries independent surveys on that, yellow are the trawl survey points, black are the ventless trap survey points, you can see that there's also a difference in the kinds of substrate that they are sampling as well. And so the question that I have then are, what are the impacts of changing lobster habitat use, both in depth, substrate type, and geomorphological type, so whether it's a flat or a slope or a crest, What are the impacts to the survey catchability and therefore our understanding of population dynamics and assessments? So this is based on some work that Robert Jarrett recently completed that uses dive surveys that noticed that in 2019 and 2021 that both the proportion of lobster observed was lower, but the proportion using different kinds of habitat. Here the yellow and the orange bars are indicating more open habitat, whereas the darker bars are rock habitat. And so I'll be following up on this study by asking this on a more regional pattern using the Maine, the Maine, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts ventless trap surveys to understand if we're seeing a similar pattern over time, and also the state nearshore trawl surveys and offshore trawl surveys to look at changes in habitat and depth as defined by bottom and surface temperature, bathymetry and depth, geomorphological features, as I mentioned, flats, depressions, and substrate. So some initial results. This is from a spatial distribution model that this is just the Maine, New Hampshire trawl survey using this as a pilot. The areas grayed out are because the trawl survey did not sample at its deepest depth in the first 3 years. But what we're seeing is that early in the time series, and I'll focus on this figure first, early in the time series, the highest abundance, this is the estimated proportion of lobster, and this is the depth on the x-axis, that the highest proportion of lobster up until about 2008 was centered around 50 meters. From 2009 to 2000 and about 1819, the use of different depths spreads out, as well as an overall higher abundance of lobsters. And after 2019, the distribution of the higher abundances is centering again more around a central depth. However, that depth is now about 75 to 100 meters. Now focusing in on this figure here, this is the estimated population or survey abundance based on the trawl survey, and this is the year here. These are different depth stratas. The green line is about a middle depth strata, about 60 meters. Blue is 150 meters, and red is 14 meters, showing that the increase that happened after 2010 was both happening at shallow and deep areas, whereas after that point, the use of deeper areas continued to increase while the use of shallower areas decreased. Now looking at how lobster and the Maine, New Hampshire trawl survey as a pilot have been changing in their habitat use. So we used chronological clustering, thanks to some wonderful code from Miguel, to look at change over time. And what we're noticing in both the geomorphological habitat and the sediment use is that there's a chronological cluster break in 2010, after which point there's an inverse use in mud habitat versus rocky habitat. And here's the overall abundance in the trawl survey, noting that they always have been catching more in mud. However, the population increase that was seen was driven by abundance in mud and sand, which are flatter open areas where the use of rock and gravel stays about the same. Looking at the Maine VTS survey, which we will look at separately, we will not combine the VTS and trawl survey. Because this survey targets rock, we are seeing that the increases were seen in both rock and mud. However, we identified a chronological cluster break in 2008 and 2009 in the use of sediment and geomorphological habitat type, and with over time, large depressions and depressions being used more, and those are associated with mud habitat. So in sum, this project is developing an integrated understanding of regime shifts and their complex impact on lobster habitat or lobster populations, with 3 central questions. Have any regions, southern New England, Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank, and nearshore regions experienced environmental regime shifts? How has predator overlap changed in the time period? And then how is habitat use changing in response to warming and potentially increasing predator exposure? And this information will help us understand the catchability and the fisheries independent trawl surveys, be able to correctly include environmental covariates and survey catchability and population assessments. And this will help us understand the stability of lobster populations in the region over time.
So if you look at the, this thing active, I guess, cool. If you look at the curves of biomass, it looks like you sort of, the early 2010s was that really different period, but the biomass curves appear to like sort of be going back to the past.
Yeah.
Is it how much can historical data of the systems that work here inform that, or is it a case where the processes underlying why we find these animals in different places are different enough that we can't really use historical analogs?
That's a great question, and one of the things that Amalia and I have been talking about a lot recently is looking at the increase in variability of habitat use, right? And so the system is rapidly changing, and so a linear trend is likely not what we're going to be seeing. And we're going to be seeing that variability, and as things like, the past couple of years with temperatures, more like they were in 2008, that it's a kind of confusing system to an animal living there. Yep.
Any other questions? Anything online?
I unfortunately missed the very beginning of your talk, sorry. I unfortunately missed the very beginning of your talk, but I wasn't sure if you looked at the availability of those sediment types in, certain depth, or they because in certain regions when you go deeper you get more of that sand, mud, those compounding variables of each other.
Definitely, yeah, so that's going to be a big component of this. So southern New England, the habitat availability is generally shallower. It's sand, gravel, muddy sand, and so the ability for a lobster to change its depth is less likely. It's just not available to them, right? And then as you move up along the coast of Maine, the habitat varies very differently, and so I'll be looking at 512, 511, and 513, the statistical areas separately, and identifying both the percentage of both sediment type and geomorphological type, and the depth profiles, as Xiaoyun had presented earlier, because it does vary in what is available to them, and also what the survey then, what the survey, especially the trawl survey, is sampling on varies by region.
Very interesting work, Claire. This is really cool to be identifying, regime shifts, and oftentimes we're doing this retrospectively, right? So we're looking backwards, and then we know we've been in a new regime, or there were three, alternative, regimes in the past. So have you thought about, the predictive capacity here? Often, so making this actionable for assessment and management, it'd be super useful to know in the first 3 years of being in a new regime, that we actually, this is what we're seeing, and how you think about predicting, and conveying, certainty of when that shift is it only in hindsight we know,
Yeah, so one of the things that I didn't mention here, but a component of the work is once we get these results is to look at the conditions that precede a regime shift or a tipping point, and to see if there are things that can be early warning indicators for that. So what is, does variability spike right before a regime shift or something? And so that can at least be somewhat of an indicator for what might be happening.
Forgive me, my background is not lobster biology, but I'm curious when
Neither is mine.
Okay. But you mentioned that looking ahead, you plan to look into abundance, and I'm curious if male to female sex ratio would be a part of that, and if you might expect to see that be important.
Yeah, definitely. So we'll look at spawning stock biomass of females separately, and so we'll look at a few different lobster population indicators, both coming out of the stock assessment, as well as some things like different size classes and sex classes or sex distributions in the trawl surveys. So we'll take the the ecosystem conditions and understand what the relationship is with those lobster population indicators, to then understand what their kind of en-suite effect is with different lobster population metrics over time. Yeah.
Anyone else? Thank you, Claire.